He decided to open a room that had been sealed for more than 120 years. Everyone thought it was just an old basement, but what he found inside made him call the FBI and panic. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The house stood on a rise at the far edge of the old quarter, its weathered timbers and cracked paint holding the patient stillness of a century. When Marcus Benton first arrived, the early spring light spread pale across its warped porch and rusted railings, revealing every scar of time. A cluster of bare elms whispered in the wind, their shadows falling in stripes across the crooked fence. For a moment, he stood still, the key heavy in his hand, listening to the groan of the old structure. He felt as if the house itself exhaled around him, welcoming him not as a stranger, but as the next keeper in a long, unfinished story. He had not expected to inherit anything. His uncle's lawyer had simply called, explaining that the last surviving Benton of that branch had left him the property on Fieldstone Hill. Marcus, a craftsman who had spent his life repairing other people's homes, could barely remember his uncle's face. The man had been quiet, withdrawn, a carpenter like himself, and his visits to Marcus's mother had always ended in whispers. Yet, something in the tone of the lawyer's letter, a formal phrasing about the preservation of family ground, had stirred a faint curiosity that Marcus could not ignore. The drive from his apartment downtown had taken him through neighborhoods that seemed to dissolve backward in time. New glass towers gave way to brick row houses, then to narrow lanes of sagging porches and forgotten churches. When he turned onto Fieldstone Avenue, the air felt heavier, filled with the scent of wet earth and old leaves. The house loomed at the end of the lane, half hidden behind the trunk of an enormous elm. Its windows were clouded, its paint peeled in long curls, and the porch sagged as though the structure were tired of holding itself up. Inside, dust lay thick on the floorboards. The air was dry and cold, carrying a faint sweetness like the smell of stored grain. Marcus's boots creaked as he stepped through the hallway. The furniture was sparse, a few chairs, a heavy oak table, an upright piano missing several keys. Everything had the same muted brown tone of neglect. In the kitchen, he found an old tin of nails, a broken clock, and a folded letter yellowed at the edges. The letter contained no words, only a hand-drawn diagram of the house, with a small mark under the cellar stairway. The mark was circled twice in pencil. It was that small circle that began to work on him. For weeks, he told himself he was here only to restore the place, maybe sell it later. Yet, at night, as he lay in the upstairs bedroom, the house seemed to whisper through its beams. He could hear the faint, hollow pulse of wind through the walls, a rhythm like breathing. Each time he descended into the cellar to inspect the foundation, his eyes drifted toward the far wall, a curved arch of darker brick, set slightly back from the rest. The mortar was coarse, uneven, as though done in haste. His uncle had once mentioned, years ago at a family gathering, that the basement had a useless old wall best left alone. At the time, Marcus had not paid attention. Now, he could not forget it. He spent his mornings clearing out debris, rusted cans, planks, jars filled with nails. He swept the dust into heaps and watched sunlight angle through the narrow basement window. But each day his gaze returned to that arch. It looked older than the house itself, the bricks blackened as if by smoke. Sometimes he thought he could smell something faintly metallic coming from it, a scent like iron and damp stone. Other times, as he worked, he imagined he heard a slow tapping within, too faint to be real. By the end of the month, the rest of the house had come back to life. He had sanded the floors, patched the plaster, replaced the cracked glass in the windows. Only the basement remained untouched. When neighbors stopped by, an elderly couple who lived 2 doors down, a mail carrier who remembered his uncle, they told him stories of the house, that it had once been a boarding home, that its builder had vanished without explanation. An old woman at the grocery store said her grandmother used to avoid walking past it after dark. Marcus listened politely, but made no comment. He didn't believe in curses, but he did believe that walls could remember. At night, sitting at the kitchen table with his tools spread before him, he caught himself sketching the arch from memory. Each line seemed to demand another. The structure fascinated him. Why would someone seal an arch instead of building a flat wall? Found himself wondering if there might be another room behind it. A root cellar, perhaps, or a tunnel to the neighboring property. The idea stirred both excitement and unease. The turning point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. A gust of wind rattled the windows and water seeped through a gap in the foundation near the arch. As Marcus knelt to seal the leak, his trowel struck something hollow. The sound echoed differently, muted, resonant, like striking an empty drum. He tapped again, and the same sound answered him. The realization hit him with a chill. There was space behind that wall. For the next few days, he tried to ignore it. He painted the upstairs hallway, fixed the porch railing, even began carving a new handrail for the staircase. But his thoughts kept returning to that hollow sound. In the quiet moments before sleep, he imagined what might lie beyond. Forgotten tools, old wine racks, a tunnel collapsed by time, or something else entirely. The diagram he had found in the kitchen drawer now seemed like a whisper from the past, a silent instruction. When he finally decided to act, it was not out of recklessness but necessity. The house seemed to demand it. Each morning the smell of damp mortar grew stronger. Each night the tapping, real or imagined, came again, as though from behind the bricks. On the morning he made up his mind. The sky was a dull gray and the air heavy with mist. He drove into town, bought a new drill, a chisel set, and a sledgehammer. The clerk joked that he must be demolishing half a building. Marcus only smiled faintly and said nothing. That evening he cleared the cellar floor, rolled back the workbench, and positioned the lamp toward the wall. The circle of light revealed the uneven mortar lines, the small cracks where age had begun to loosen the seal. He stood for a long time, listening to the steady hum of his own breath. Then he placed the drill bit against the brick and pulled the trigger. The vibration surged through his arms. Dust cascaded in thin streams. Each movement filled the space with a low, pulsing growl. When he stopped, there was a single round hole no wider than his thumb. He leaned close. From within came a faint rush of cold air, dry and metallic. The smell of old earth and iron filled his lungs. He stepped back, heart beating fast, staring at the wall that had hidden something for more than a century. The house was utterly silent now, as if waiting. For the first time since he had arrived, Marcus felt the full weight of its age pressing down on him, not as menace, but as expectation. Upstairs, the wind moved through the empty hallway, rattling the doors. He turned off the drill, set down the hammer, and wiped the dust from his hands. The single hole in the arch looked like a dark eye watching him. He told himself he would finish the work tomorrow, that he only needed rest. But even as he climbed the creaking stairs, he knew that tomorrow he would return with the sledgehammer. The mystery behind that wall had already claimed him. That night, he dreamed of breathing, not his own, but the slow, deep exhalation of the house itself, ancient, rhythmic, and patient, as if the walls had lungs and were waiting to release the air they had held for more than 100 years. When he woke, the first light of dawn slid through the window, and he could almost feel the pulse of the old structure beneath his feet. The house was alive, and it was waiting for him to set it free. Morning light filtered weakly through the basement window, catching in the haze that lingered from the dust of the night before. Marcus stood before the wall, sleeves rolled, gloves on, staring at the small round hole he had drilled. The air that seeped from it was cooler than the rest of the room, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature but with time itself. It was as though the void beyond had never been touched by warmth or light. He placed his palm over the opening and felt the faintest whisper of air brush his skin, a breath from another century. He knew then there was no turning back. Whatever slept behind those bricks was already awake in his mind. He began with measured strikes. The sledgehammer rose and fell, each impact sending a dull thud reverberating through the foundation. Dust burst in pale clouds that caught the lamp's glow like smoke. After the first dozen blows, his shoulders burned and sweat dripped from his forehead, tracing clean lines through the gray powder on his skin. The wall resisted with a stubbornness that felt unnatural. It was thicker than it had any right to be, layers upon layers of mortar packed as though by hands determined never to let anything pass. Each time a brick loosened, another behind it seemed to lock tighter. The echo of his labor filled the house above. Floorboard. By midday, he had managed only a shallow crater in the wall. He stopped to drink water, leaning against the workbench, staring at his progress. The dust had turned the air opaque, coating every surface in fine ash. The hole gaped like a wound in the brick, a glimpse of darkness that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. His breathing echoed off the stone, mingling with the rhythmic drip of condensation from the pipes overhead. He felt oddly conscious of being watched, though he was alone. Each swing of the hammer felt heavier, as if the house itself were pushing back. He switched tools, grabbing the drill to carve deeper lines into the mortar. The bit screamed as it tore into the wall, scattering sparks when it hit something hard. He paused, frowning, and examined the mark. There was iron embedded between the bricks, thin rods crossing the masonry like ribs. Someone had reinforced the wall deliberately, not to hold the house up, but to hold something in. The realization crept through him slowly, and he set the drill aside, staring at the metal glint. The rods were old, dark with rust, but still solid. They had been hammered deep before the final layer of brick sealed them. He touched one with his fingertips. It was cold enough to sting. Afternoon light shifted to amber. The air in the basement grew thick, heavy with dust. He swung the hammer again, this time with anger instead of patience. Chips of brick scattered across the floor. The sound of metal giving way cracked through the silence, sharp and final. One of the iron rods snapped with a ringing note that made his ears ring. Then another. The vibrations raced up his arms. When he stopped to catch his breath, he noticed the faint tremor in the ground beneath his feet, as though the house had sighed in relief or warning. He thought of his uncle then, of how the old man had lived alone here for decades, keeping the house closed to everyone. What had he known? Had he ever stood in this same spot, hammer in hand, tempted by the same curiosity? The thought unsettled him. He imagined his uncle's voice, low and grave, saying the words Marcus had read in the letter upstairs. Some things are better sealed. But Marcus had never been one to leave a question unanswered. He had rebuilt collapsed barns and restored burned-out churches. To him, no wall was impenetrable. no mystery too deep. Yet this one felt different. It wasn't just age that made it strong, it was intention. Night crept in without him noticing. The single bulb above flickered, casting long, trembling shadows across the room. The air had turned gritty. His throat burned from breathing dust. He decided to rest, sitting on a crate with his back against the foundation. His muscles throbbed, his hands raw from gripping the hammer. Through the small hole, he could see nothing, only blackness so pure it felt solid. He turned off the drill and for a moment listened to the silence. But it wasn't silent. There was something faint beyond the wall, a low hum or vibration, like wind moving through a narrow corridor. He held his breath. The sound stopped. When he exhaled, he told himself it was the house settling, nothing more. The next morning, he woke sore but restless. Over coffee, he stared out the kitchen window at the elm that shaded the yard. Its branches swayed without wind. He thought he saw the curtains move in the basement window below, but when he checked, nothing stirred. Downstairs, the smell of brick dust clung to everything. He took up the hammer again, more determined than before. This time he worked systematically, striking at the seams, prying out one brick after another. Beneath each layer the mortar grew darker, richer with iron and age. After hours of pounding, the hole widened enough for him to peer inside. At first, he saw only more stone. Then, as his flashlight beam pierced deeper, he glimpsed the curve of another wall just beyond the opening, forming what looked like a small chamber. He crouched, shining the light through the gap. The beam reflected off something metallic, then off glass. A flicker of excitement broke through his exhaustion. There was definitely a space behind it, sealed, hidden, and untouched. He imagined crates, maybe old tools, perhaps even wine bottles left from the 19th century. The rational part of his mind insisted that was all it was, but another part whispered possibilities he could not name. The following hours blurred together. He worked until his arms felt numb, until sweat ran into his eyes and stung. The dust thickened into a fog, swirling in the beam of his light. At last, a line of darkness split open, stretching from floor to arch. Marcus stepped back as loose mortar fell in soft bursts. Then, with a hollow groan, one section of brick gave way entirely, collapsing inward. A rush of stale air poured out, smelling of earth, oil, and something faintly sweet, like the scent of old paper or dried flowers. It was the breath of the sealed room, escaping after more than a century. He covered his mouth with his sleeve and waited for the dust to settle. When it cleared, the gap revealed a void beyond, a narrow chamber barely wider than a closet. The beam of his flashlight swept across wood beams, a table, the corner of a crate, and something else, a shadowed shape he couldn't identify. The sight stopped him cold. There was no movement, yet the stillness inside felt charged, alive in a way that made his pulse quicken. He leaned closer, listening. The silence was immense, like the pause before thunder. He stepped back, uncertain. The job was done. The wall had yielded, but now that the passage stood open, a new unease crept over him. The air seemed to shift with each breath he took. The faint hum he had heard before was stronger now, a resonance he could almost feel in his bones. He turned off the light for a moment, testing the darkness. Instantly he regretted it. The blackness pressed against him, total and suffocating, until he flipped the switch again, and the world returned in shades of gray and gold dust. He told himself it was exhaustion, nothing more. The smell, the sound, the weight of air. his mind playing tricks after hours of labor. He backed away slowly, set down the hammer, and leaned on the workbench. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. For the first time, he wondered if the wall had been meant to protect the room from people, or people from the room. He forced himself to clean up, stacking the broken bricks in a neat pile, sweeping the dust into a bucket. He didn't want to leave chaos behind. He turned off the light, climbed the stairs, and closed the basement door. Upstairs, the house felt strangely quiet. The ticking of the old clock in the hallway sounded louder than usual, echoing through the still air. Marcus poured himself a glass of water and sat at the table. The tools lay downstairs waiting, the arch now broken, the secret beyond it exposed but unexplored. He thought he would feel triumph, but what he felt instead was the weight of intrusion. When he finally went to bed, the night seemed endless. The sound of dripping pipes below pulsed through the floorboards. He could picture the open gap in the basement, the air still seeping through, mingling with the rest of the house. Around 3 a.m, he woke to a faint vibration, a single, soft thud from beneath him, like something settling or shifting. He lay still, heart hammering, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't. At dawn, he rose, drawn back downstairs before even realizing he had decided to go. The basement was cooler, the smell of dust still hanging thick. The hole in the wall looked larger in daylight, the shadows inside softer but no less deep. He crouched beside it, letting his fingers trace the edge of the broken bricks. Beyond the opening, the light caught on a metallic glimmer, perhaps a hinge or a nail head or something far older. The silence pressed close, thick, and patient. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the still air that had once been sealed away, feeling as though the house was breathing with him again. Only this time, its breath came from the other side of the wall. The morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that made the house seem half asleep. Marcus moved slowly through the kitchen, his muscles stiff from the day before. He poured coffee, though he barely tasted it, his mind already downstairs. The memory of that stale breath of air from behind the wall clung to him. It had been more than a scent. It had been a feeling, a whisper of something preserved beyond reason. He tried to tell himself that what he found would be mundane, perhaps an abandoned pantry or storage space, nothing more. But every time he pictured that darkness, it filled his thoughts with a strange pull, like gravity drawing him back underground. By the time he reached the basement, the light through the small window had shifted to a dull gold. Dust still hung in the air, shimmering faintly, a haze of centuries disturbed. The gap in the wall yawned wider than he remembered, its edges jagged, bricks crumbling inward. He stood there for a moment, listening. The faint hum he'd imagined the night before was gone. The silence now was total, deep enough that he could hear the soft beat of his own pulse. He switched on the portable work light, directing its beam through the opening. The chamber beyond glowed faintly. The first thing he saw was a table. It stood in the center of the room, its surface layered with dust so thick it looked like felt. Beside it sat a wooden chair with one leg broken and mended roughly with wire. Against the far wall, shelves lined with jars, ledgers, and boxes slumped under their own weight. Everything was coated in gray, undisturbed. On one wall, beneath the curve of the arch, hung a single framed portrait. The face was of a man in a dark suit, one hand resting on a book, the other holding a hat. His eyes, painted with meticulous care, met Marcus's gaze with unnerving intensity. Beneath the portrait, a brass plate bore an inscription too faded to read. Marcus hesitated at the threshold. The air was colder inside, dry and thick, as though the oxygen itself had aged. When he ducked under the arch and stepped into the room, the floor gave slightly under his boots, creaking in protest. The smell of oil, paper, and earth surrounded him, old but not unpleasant. It was like stepping into a forgotten memory. He ran his gloved hand across the table, leaving a clean streak through the dust. The wood beneath was dark oak, finely crafted. Whoever had built this room had cared about its details. He swept the light slowly across the shelves. Old jars filled with murky liquid, rolls of parchment tied with string, and a row of glass bottles with cork stoppers glimmered faintly in the beam. The bottles contained what looked like ink, though one held something thicker, dark as blood. On the shelves below he found books with cracked leather bindings, their titles too faded to read. One had collapsed, its pages curled like leaves. Near it, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon sat untouched. When he reached for it, the ribbon disintegrated in his hand, and the papers fell softly apart. The handwriting was elegant, looping, written in dark brown ink that had seeped into the fibers like veins. Most of the words were in English, but some phrases were in Latin, others in shorthand. One page carried a single sentence repeated several times, as though the writer had been reciting it by hand. A house must remember what the world forgets. The phrase appeared again in different handwriting, underlined twice. Beneath it was a signature. E. Benton. Marcus froze. Benton, his own family name. He turned the page and found another note written in haste, almost frantic. If this place should ever be opened, let the one who finds it understand that walls are built not just to keep danger out, but to keep truth in. He stepped back, staring at the note in disbelief. The letters trembled in his hand, and a faint tremor ran through his chest. His family had been in this city since the late 1800s. He knew the stories of his great-grandfather Elijah Benton, a craftsman who built houses and churches, who had fallen into debt and lost his land during the early years of the last century. Could this handwriting belong to him? If so, what had he hidden here? He lifted the flashlight higher and aimed it toward the far corner. There, half buried under a shroud of dust, stood a trunk, iron-rimmed, its lock rusted, its leather straps brittle. Beside it leaned an old lantern, its glass clouded. He crouched, brushed off the surface of the trunk, and saw the initials burned into the lid. E.B. His heartbeat quickened. The lock looked ancient, but the metal had weakened with time. With a careful blow of the hammer, it snapped cleanly. The lid creaked as it opened, releasing a breath of air that smelled faintly of cedar and something long decayed. Inside were small parcels wrapped in linen, several notebooks, and a bundle of folded documents sealed with wax. The wax bore an emblem, two interlocking circles, one dark, one light. He had seen that symbol before, carved faintly into the lintel above the basement door, though he'd thought it was just an ornament. Beneath the papers lay a small wooden box no bigger than a loaf of bread. It was bound with string and labeled in spidery handwriting, to be opened only by one who bears the name. His throat tightened as he read it. The name meant him. He set the box aside, unwilling to open it yet. Instead, he examined the notebooks. Each one contained lists, names, dates, brief notes like arrived safely, gone south, taken at night. They looked like records of people, perhaps workers or residents, but the tone was somber, the words taken and missing appearing too often. In the margins of one, a passage stood out. The city burns its history with silence. If we cannot save them, let their names at least survive in walls. The handwriting shifted midway through, as if written by different people at different times. Some entries stopped abruptly, leaving lines unfinished. On the opposite wall, yellowed papers had been pinned in neat rows. He stepped closer and realized they were maps, hand-drawn layouts of the neighborhood as it had looked more than a century ago. Streets with unfamiliar names, buildings long demolished. Lines in red ink connected several locations, each marked with a circle. The circles formed a pattern that looked deliberate, like a web. In the lower corner of one map was a phrase written in pencil, "Houses of Refuge." Marcus traced the lines with his finger, his heart heavy. He had read about secret networks before, places where people fleeing violence found temporary shelter, but those stories belonged to history books, not his family's basement. As he turned back towards the table, his light caught something glinting near the floor. He crouched and brushed away the dust. There, embedded in the brick, was a small brass plaque, half tarnished but still legible. It bore a single sentence, "For those the world would not see." The words sank into him. He sat on the cold floor, the papers in his lap, and tried to piece it together. This wasn't a hiding place for treasure or contraband. It was a memorial, a record. The Bentons had built this chamber not to hoard, but to remember. His mind raced with questions. What had happened to these people? Why had the room been sealed? The dates in the ledgers ended abruptly around 1902, the same year his great-grandfather had vanished from census records. It was possible that what had begun as a refuge had ended in disaster, exposed or betrayed. The sudden end of the entries suggested something violent, a rupture that had forced the survivors to erase all trace of the place. And if that was true, then this room was a tomb of stories buried to protect others. He felt an unexpected wave of sorrow. These names, these careful records, someone had written them, knowing that no one might ever read them. The silence that had preserved them now weighed on him. He looked again at the box labeled with his family name. The handwriting was unmistakably the same as in the letters. His ancestor had intended for this to be found someday, but only by someone willing to understand. The thought filled him with both pride and dread. He carried the box upstairs, placing it gently on the kitchen table. The house was quiet, as if holding its breath. He washed his hands, watching the dust spiral away in the sink, but the smell of the cellar clung to him, earthy, metallic, ancient. When he sat down again, the box waited in front of him, its string taut, its surface carved with faint decorative lines. He thought of opening it then and there, but something inside him resisted. It felt wrong to do it casually, without preparation. He would take photographs, document everything properly. He owed that to whoever had left it behind. That night, the house creaked and settled as always, but he heard something different, a rhythmic tapping, slow and deliberate, like rain on a roof. Only there was no rain. It came from below. He sat up in bed, listening. The sound stopped, then resumed, faintly irregular, as if echoing through the pipes. He almost rose to check, but exhaustion pinned him down. He drifted between waking and sleep, dreaming of hands sealing bricks, faces fading behind walls, and voices whispering names that time had swallowed. When morning came, he stood by the window watching the first light touch the elm branches. The world outside looked unchanged, yet he felt altered, part of something much older than himself. Downstairs, the open wall waited, and beyond it, the room where time had stopped. He knew now it wasn't just a forgotten chamber. It was a fragment of memory, a heartbeat that had been silenced for a century. And he, for reasons he didn't yet understand, had been chosen to hear it again. Marcus woke before sunrise, restless, unable to shake the images that had haunted his dreams. The names in the ledgers, the careful handwriting of his ancestor, the faint tapping that had echoed through the night. It all clung to him like the scent of dust after a storm. The kitchen was dim and silent as he poured coffee, his hands trembling slightly. Outside, a weak orange light bled into the sky, outlining the elm tree that loomed over the yard. The air carried the heavy stillness of a place waiting for something to be revealed. He had not yet opened the wooden box. It sat on the table where he had left it, its string still tied, its surface faintly marked with fingerprints from his work the day before. For a moment, he simply stared at it, thinking of the inscription on the wall downstairs. For those the world would not see. The words had burrowed into him. He wondered if his great-grandfather had sealed this place out of shame or protection, whether he had been hiding evidence of guilt or preserving the memory of the innocent. The uncertainty made his stomach twist. After finishing his coffee, Marcus went back down to the basement. The morning light fell weakly through the small window, illuminating the open archway and the pale dust still floating in the air. The room beyond looked unchanged, as though it were indifferent to his discovery. Yet to Marcus, everything now carried weight. A chair, a scrap of paper, a single thread of spiderweb glinting in the light. Each seemed to whisper that it belonged to a story left unfinished. He knelt beside the table again, tracing the edges of the ledgers he had left there. One of them, bound in dark leather, had a torn spine. When he opened it, a pressed flower fell out, brittle and colorless. Between its pages was a list of names, followed by short notes. Safe, gone north, taken, unknown. Some entries included addresses, many of which were in the same district, all now unrecognizable after a century of change. What unsettled Marcus most was that a few names were familiar. He had seen them before in public records, in plaques and street signs honoring old families who still wielded influence in the city. He needed context, something to make sense of it. After hours spent leafing through the notebooks, he realized he could not do this alone. He photographed each page carefully, wrapped the ledgers in the protective cloth, and decided to visit the public library downtown. The building, one of the few still standing from the early 20th century, seemed the right place to begin. The librarian directed him to the archives room, where he filled out a request for local property and census records from 1890 to 1910. While he waited, he searched through newspaper microfilms. The flickering headlines slid across the screen. Fires, protests, missing persons, property seizures. Then he stopped at a small notice dated 1902. Local craftsman Elijah Benton declared insolvent. Property on Fieldstone Hill sold at auction. Below that, another article a few weeks later, unidentified man found dead near riverbank. No family claims body. There was no photograph, but the timing sent a chill through Marcus. He knew without doubt that the dead man was his great-grandfather. When the archivist brought the files, Marcus traced the old property maps. His house, the one he now lived in, had once stood at the edge of a network of small workshops and row houses. Several of those properties had been marked acquired by city ordinance. In the margins of one document, a handwritten note read, "Lot to be inspected. Known refuge activity. Refuge." The same word from the maps pinned to the cellar wall. He copied everything he could, filled a notebook with dates and addresses, and left as the library lights flickered off for closing. Outside, the city seemed sharper, louder. Passing cars hissed through puddles on the wet streets, but the noise barely reached him. He walked as though half asleep, his mind replaying the discovery. Elijah Benton had built a sanctuary beneath his home, a place of safety in an era of fear, and for that he had lost everything. His death, quiet and forgotten, had erased not only his life, but the truth of what he had done. Marcus felt anger swelling within him, mingled with grief. That night, back at the house, he spread his findings across the kitchen table. The candlelight cast wavering shadows over the maps, as if the past were trying to move. He compared the addresses from the ledgers to the historical map and began drawing lines between them. A pattern emerged. The marks formed a crescent stretching through the old industrial district toward the river. There had been several houses of refuge, connected not by tunnels perhaps, but by shared purpose. His family's home had been one node in that chain. As he traced those lines, he remembered the bundle of letters tied with ribbon in the basement. Fetching them, he opened the first, careful not to let the fragile paper tear. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were still legible. "Elijah, they are closing in. We cannot move them again. The officials know. I have hidden the children in the cellar. If they find us, say nothing." Another letter, written in a trembling hand. "The men came at night. We sealed the door. God forgive us." Marcus set the paper down, his heart pounding. These were not the records of a craftsman or a businessman. He thought of the wall, of how strong it had been, reinforced with iron. It wasn't built to imprison something sinister, it was built to protect those within from the world outside. Every blow of his sledgehammer had undone the work of people who had once fought to keep others alive. He felt the weight of guilt pressing on him, though reason told him he couldn't have known. Still, the thought gnawed at him that by opening the wall he had disturbed a silence that had been sacred. Unable to sit still, he went down again, carrying the letters with him. The basement seemed darker than before. His footsteps echoed off the stone. He set the candle on the table inside the hidden chamber and watched its light flicker against the portrait on the wall. For the first time, he noticed that the painted man's expression seemed different, as though age and dust had changed it. The eyes followed him, calm yet severe. Beneath the candlelight, the brass nameplate reflected a dull gleam, revealing a single word he hadn't been able to read before. Benton. Marcus whispered the name aloud, and the sound of it filled the room with uncanny resonance. He imagined Elijah here, sealing the last bricks, leaving his work unfinished but necessary. The idea that his ancestor had died alone while trying to protect others struck him deeply. He stayed there a long time, staring at the table and the walls until the candle had almost burned down. The following day, determined to verify his findings, he contacted the university's historical department. After several calls, he was referred to a young historian named Dr. Carrie Goodwin, an expert in post-Civil War migration and urban development. When he told her about the ledgers and the letters, she sounded skeptical at first but agreed to meet him. They arranged to meet at a cafe near campus that afternoon. Carrie was in her early 30s, sharp-eyed and deliberate in her movements. When Marcus showed her photographs of the room and the documents, her skepticism melted into astonishment. She explained that there had been rumors of small networks in the early 1900s that sheltered people fleeing racial violence in the South, safe houses that continued the spirit of the Underground Railroad long after it had been forgotten. Most records of those networks had vanished. If the documents he had found were genuine, they could rewrite part of the city's history. She offered to help him authenticate the materials, to cross-check handwriting, dates, and paper composition. Together, they planned to map out the other refuge houses mentioned in the ledgers. Carrie's enthusiasm was contagious, and for the first time, Marcus felt something like hope. Perhaps this discovery wasn't only about uncovering pain. It might also be a chance to restore dignity to those erased by time. Over the next week, they worked tirelessly. They visited libraries, combed through archives, and spoke to descendants of families listed in the ledgers. Some recognized names that had been passed down only as whispers in family stories. One elderly woman wept when Marcus showed her a photograph of her great-grandmother's name written in Elijah's hand. "My mother said we were helped by a man who built houses," she said softly. "We never knew where she hid, only that someone brave kept her safe." Each confirmation strengthened Marcus's resolve, but also deepened the sense of burden. The truth he uncovered was beautiful and terrible. His ancestor had been part of a movement of quiet defiance, men and women who risked everything to protect others. But he had paid for it with his life, and those who benefited had gone on to erase him. Marcus realized the injustice was not just historical. It was living, woven into the foundations of the city itself. Late one evening, while Carrie examined handwriting samples at her office, Marcus returned home alone. The house was dark except for the faint glow from the basement. He descended the stairs slowly, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. The air felt heavier than usual. The candle he had left earlier had burned down to wax, leaving only the faint scent of smoke. Yet something about the silence felt different. When he stepped into the chamber, he noticed that the wooden box was no longer where he had left it upstairs. It sat on the table now, its string untied. For a long moment, he simply stared, unable to move. Inside, neatly arranged, were photographs, sepia-toned, fragile. They showed groups of people standing before houses much like his own, their faces solemn but proud. On the back of one, written in faint pencil, "May they find peace." He flipped through each picture, his hands shaking. The last one showed a man he recognized instantly from the portrait on the wall, Elijah Benton, standing beside the unfinished arch, a hammer in one hand, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion. At his feet, a child no older than 10 looked up at him. The resemblance between the boy and Marcus was undeniable. He felt tears sting his eyes. The room seemed to pulse around him, alive with memory. Every brick, every nail had been a part of a story his family had tried to protect. He realized then that he wasn't just uncovering history, he was continuing it. The responsibility was immense. He gathered the photographs carefully, replacing them in the box, and whispered a promise to the air that he would not let the truth disappear again. When Carrie visited the next morning and saw the photographs, she was speechless. Together, they documented everything, labeling, cataloging, scanning. They spoke of exhibitions, publications, community remembrance. Yet, beneath the excitement, Marcus felt a subtle unease he could not name. The house had grown restless. The tapping had returned, faint but constant, like the echo of footsteps deep within the walls. Sometimes, when he worked late, he felt the temperature drop suddenly, and the scent of cedar and smoke would rise from nowhere. But he no longer feared it. He understood now that the house was breathing again, stirring after its long sleep. It carried the voices of those who had once depended on its silence, and now that silence had been broken. Standing at the open archway one evening, Marcus touched the rough edge of the brick and whispered, "I hear you." and for a brief moment it seemed as though the still air answered with a sigh, old and grateful, as if Elijah himself were standing somewhere beyond the light, watching his descendant carry the torch forward. The days that followed blurred into one another, filled with a restless energy that neither Marcus nor Carrie could escape. The discovery had become larger than them, spreading like a spark through the brittle surface of the city's collective memory. What had begun as a family mystery now reached outward, touching archives, newspapers, even social circles that preferred the past remained politely unspoken. Carrie's contacts at the university grew excited. Historians and journalists requested meetings. The more Marcus learned about what his ancestor had built, the more he realized how deliberately it had been erased. But truth, once uncovered, never stayed quiet for long, and the house on Fieldstone Hill had awakened forces far beyond his control. By the second week of their collaboration, the first article appeared online, a small feature describing the discovery of a forgotten refuge site beneath a Boston home. The tone was cautious, almost romantic in its language, but within hours it was shared hundreds of times. Soon, local reporters began calling, wanting interviews, photographs, access. Carrie urged restraint, warning that publicity could invite problems before the documents were authenticated. Marcus agreed, but it was already too late. Once the story left their hands, it belonged to the world, and the world was hungry. That evening, as dusk fell across the yard, Marcus stood at the window and watched the headlights move slowly down the street. The house, once forgotten, now drew attention. Strangers lingered by the fence, pretending to check their phones while peering toward the porch. He saw the same car pass twice, its windows tinted. A chill ran through him, not from paranoia, but instinct. There were those, he realized, who had a stake in keeping the past sealed. The names in the ledgers had not all been victims. Some had been perpetrators, and their descendants still carried influence in city offices, banks, and development firms. The past was never truly buried. It merely waited for someone to disturb the soil. That night, he dreamt of his great-grandfather again. Elijah stood by the archway, the hammer in his hand, his face streaked with soot. Behind him, faint outlines of people huddled in the darkness, whispering prayers. When Marcus tried to call out, Elijah raised a finger to his lips, signaling silence, and then the image dissolved into the sound of bricks being laid, one upon another, until the wall rose between them once more. Marcus awoke, drenched in sweat, the rhythm of hammering still echoing in his ears. In the morning, the phone rang. It was Carrie, her voice low. Nothing was stolen, but her desk had been moved, her papers shifted. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but then she found a note slipped under her door. It contained only 2 words written in block letters. Stop digging. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He told her to come to the house, that they needed to talk in person. When she arrived an hour later, her eyes were tired but determined. Together they went down into the cellar, standing before the open archway. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with the smell of old brick. Marcus told her about the car that had been circling the street, about the strange figures he'd glimpsed near the fence. Carrie nodded grimly. "You've uncovered something that was never meant to see daylight," she said, "and someone out there knows exactly what it means if it does." Marcus leaned against the wall, staring at the ledger that still lay on the table. "This isn't just history anymore," he said quietly. "It's power, and power never gives itself up willingly." They decided to back up every document, photograph, and map. Carrie brought a scanner, and together they spent hours creating digital copies. The rhythmic hum of the machine echoed through the cellar, mingling with the faint creaks of the old house. By nightfall, they had saved nearly everything to multiple drives. Marcus locked one in a safe upstairs and handed another to Carrie to keep off sight. "If something happens," he told her, "make sure this doesn't disappear again." She hesitated before nodding, her expression unreadable. Later that week, Marcus returned home from work to find the front door slightly ajar. Nothing inside seemed disturbed, but a subtle wrongness lingered in the air, like the faint smell of smoke after a match is struck. He checked the basement. The ledgers were still there, the photographs undisturbed, but on the table lay a single white envelope. Inside was a newspaper clipping from 1902, the same article he'd found in the archives announcing Elijah Benton's insolvency. Across it, in red pen, someone had scrawled the words, "Let it rest." There was no signature. For the first time, Marcus felt fear, not of the past, but of the present. He called Carrie immediately, but she didn't answer. Hours later, she returned his call, apologizing. Her phone had been confiscated temporarily by campus security after she'd reported the break-in. She insisted that he contact the police, but Marcus hesitated. What could he tell them? That he was being threatened over century-old documents found in his basement. They would laugh, or worse, file a report and forget it. He knew instinctively that whoever was behind the warnings had reach, perhaps even among those meant to enforce the law. He spent that night in the living room, a baseball bat resting beside the couch. The house creaked and sighed as always, but every sound now carried new meaning. When the wind rattled the window panes, he imagined footsteps. When the floorboards settled, he imagined whispers. At some point before dawn, exhaustion overtook him. He dreamed again of the cellar, only this time the room beyond the arch was crowded with people. Men, women, and children, their faces blurred, their bodies fading like smoke. They stared at him silently, waiting. He woke with tears on his face, the faint scent of cedar in the air. Over the following days, small disturbances continued. Mail arrived torn open. His tools were moved from their shelves. A brick from the edge of the archway fell for no reason, shattering on the floor. Marcus began to sense that the house itself shared his tension, its timbers groaning under invisible weight. Yet even in fear, he refused to retreat. The truth was no longer just about history. It was about justice and memory and his family's name. One evening, as he was cataloging photographs, Carrie called again, her voice hushed. She had discovered something buried in a municipal record, a sealed file marked confidential from 1903. Inside was evidence that the refuge houses had been deliberately raided under the guise of property inspections. Several officials named in the documents were ancestors of prominent local politicians. The Benton property had been the last target before the network was destroyed. Elijah's death had not been an accident. It had been a silencing. Marcus felt a hollow ache spread through him as she spoke. The pieces fell into place. The wall, the reinforced bricks, the secrecy. Elijah had sealed the room after the final raid, hiding whatever records might condemn the powerful. He had buried the truth to protect others, and in doing so had ensured his own ruin. That was a legacy Marcus had inherited. They decided to confront the story head-on. The next week, they organized a community meeting at the library to present preliminary findings. Flyers circulated quietly through neighborhoods, shared among churches and local organizations. On the evening of the event, the small auditorium filled beyond capacity. Marcus stood at the front, his hands trembling as he looked over the faces of people who had come. Descendants of those once erased, students, elders, even reporters. He began to speak, his voice low but steady, recounting the discovery, the letters, the photographs, the truth of what had been hidden beneath his home. When he finished, silence filled the room, thick and electric. Then someone began to clap, followed by another until the sound swelled to a wave of applause. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, an older man approached him. His gray suit was expensive, his demeanor careful. He introduced himself as Richard Harlow, a member of the city council. "Mr. Benton," he said with an oily smile, "you've stirred quite a conversation, but I'd advise you to tread carefully. History can be complicated. Sometimes it's better left in peace." His eyes glinted with something that wasn't quite threat, but wasn't far from it. Marcus held his gaze without speaking. When Harlow finally turned to leave, Marcus felt the faint tremor of rage beneath his calm. That night, after the meeting, Marcus drove home through empty streets, the weight of everything pressing on him. The wind had risen, rattling the elm branches against the windows. As he parked, he noticed smoke curling from the corner of the yard. At first he thought it was mist, but then he smelled the unmistakable sharpness of burning wood. He ran towards the porch and froze. Flames licked up the side of the house, small but fast, fed by dry leaves. He grabbed the hose, spraying wildly until the fire died, leaving a black scar across the siding. Someone had tried to burn him out. The police came, took notes, made polite assurances. No one was arrested. In the aftermath, the neighborhood rallied around him. Strangers left food, messages of support, offers of help. Yet beneath the solidarity lay fear, the sense that a line had been crossed, that old wounds had reopened. Marcus repaired the damage himself, hammering new boards over the charred wood. With each strike, he thought of Elijah, of the generations who had built and rebuilt in the face of destruction. The work steadied him. When he finally returned to the cellar, the air was cool again. The dust settled. He lit a candle and placed it on the table. The flame wavered gently, throwing long shadows on the walls. "They tried to stop you once," he whispered, "and now they're trying to stop me. But we're still here." For a moment, he thought he heard the faintest rustle in the darkness beyond, like the sound of someone shifting their weight, or perhaps simply the house breathing again. He stayed there a long time, the candle burning low. Above him, the city hummed, oblivious, its lights gleaming against the night. Below, in the silence of the cellar, the air was thick with memory, sorrow, and defiance. The wall that had once separated safety from danger now stood open, and the truth that had waited behind it would not be sealed again. The fire had left a faint black scar on the siding of the house, a mark that refused to wash away no matter how carefully Marcus scrubbed it. Even after the smoke smell had faded, the memory of the flames lingered, like a warning whispered by the wind each time it rattled the elm branches. Days passed in uneasy silence. He tried to resume normal life, repairing furniture for clients, meeting Carrie for coffee, but something had shifted in him, something that could not be undone. The story that had slept beneath his home had awakened, and now it lived in the eyes of everyone who looked his way. Some offered encouragement, others pity, but a few, those whose families' names he had seen in the ledgers, avoided him altogether. The exhibition had been Carrie's idea. If they try to bury it again, "We'll make it too public to kill," she'd said, her voice trembling not from fear but resolve. They worked together day and night, scanning each page, cataloging photographs, creating careful replicas of the artifacts from the hidden chamber. The university library agreed to host the exhibit, though its administrators insisted on neutral language for the announcement, an exploration of early 20th century refuge networks. Even the title felt like a compromise, a way of softening the sharp edges of truth. Yet, Marcus knew it didn't matter. On the morning of the unveiling, the sky was low and heavy, promising rain. Marcus arrived early, carrying the wooden box that had started it all. Inside were the photographs, Elijah's letters, the cross he had found buried in the ashes after the fire. He set the box in the display case at the center of the room, surrounded by enlarged prints of the maps and ledgers. The lights above were soft and golden, casting a gentle glow on the relics. He felt a strange calm, a sense of completion. For the first time, his ancestors' work would be seen, not hidden. The silence of a century would end here. By noon, the hall was crowded. Journalists with cameras, students, historians, families of those whose names appeared in the records. Marcus stood near the back, letting Carrie lead the presentation. She spoke clearly, explaining the historical context, the methods of verification, the links between the documents and known events. Then she gestured toward Marcus. "This discovery began with him," she said, "and it belongs to all of us now." The crowd turned as he stepped forward. He hadn't prepared a speech, but words came anyway, quiet and steady. "My great-grandfather built his home to shelter others," he said. "He sealed its walls not to hide shame, but to protect the truth. That truth was buried for generations. We can't change what happened, but we can decide not to forget." Applause rose slowly, spreading through the room like a tide. Yet, beneath the warmth of that moment, Marcus felt the faint tremor of unease. A figure stood near the doorway, a man in a gray suit, tall, motionless, watching without expression. Marcus recognized him immediately. Richard Harlow, the councilman who had warned him to stay quiet. Their eyes met briefly before Harlow turned and slipped into the crowd. The applause faded. The celebration continued, but Marcus couldn't shake the sense that the battle wasn't over. 2 days later, the storm arrived. Sheets of rain pounded the streets, flooding gutters and turning the air thick and electric. Marcus sat by the window, listening to the wind whistle through the old panes. He thought about the exhibit, the articles that had followed, the flood of attention that now surrounded his family's name. He should have felt vindicated. Instead, he felt exposed. His phone buzzed with messages, support, congratulations, but also hate. Anonymous numbers sent him words sharp as blades. Liar, traitor, leave the dead alone. One message included a photograph of his house, taken that very night from across the street. The caption read simply, "Some walls should stay closed." He called the police again, but they offered the same polite indifference. "Probably just trolls," the officer said. "Don't engage online." But this wasn't online. This was his doorstep. That night, Marcus sat in the dark, watching the rain slide down the window. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. He thought of Elijah, alone, hunted, sealing the final bricks as men approached his home. He understood him now, not just as an ancestor, but as a man driven by the same stubborn belief that truth, even when dangerous, must be preserved. The next morning brought chaos. Carrie called at dawn, her voice tight. Vandals had broken into the exhibit overnight. Glass cases shattered, papers scattered, photographs torn. The box with the photographs was missing. Marcus drove through the flooded streets, his heart pounding. At the library, yellow police tape crossed the entrance. Inside, shards of glass glittered like ice on the floor. The curator stood near the wreckage, pale and shaken. "They didn't steal everything," she said softly. "Just the originals. The rest they destroyed." Marcus felt hollow. The loss wasn't just material, it was spiritual. Those items had carried the weight of generations, the tangible bridge between past and present. Now they were gone, vanished like Elijah himself. Carrie tried to reassure him. "We still have the digital copies," she said. "They can't erase it now." But Marcus barely heard her. He walked to the empty display case, staring at the faint outline left by the missing box. The silence in the hall felt suffocating, heavy with the ghosts of all that had been lost again. In the following days, the news spread fast. Some blamed vandals opposed to political revisionism. Others suspected an inside job. Conspiracy theories bloomed like weeds. Yet, for Marcus, the truth was simpler. History had always fought to bury itself. What had happened to Elijah was happening again, echoing through time with cruel precision. But something was different now. The story was out in the open. Even if the objects were gone, the words, the images, the proof, they lived on. Still, the attack took its toll. Marcus began receiving threats again, more direct this time. One night, someone spray-painted the word "liar" across his fence. Another morning, a dead crow lay on his porch, its wings stiff, its beak pointing toward the cellar door. He buried it in the garden without speaking, his hands trembling. The fear was real, but beneath it was defiance. The same quiet strength that had kept Elijah building even as the world closed in. Carrie urged him to leave town for a while, to stay with friends, but Marcus couldn't abandon the house. It had become more than a home. It was a living witness. "If I leave," he told her, "they win twice, once for him, once for me." She understood but hated it. That night, as she drove away, he stood on the porch and watched her taillights vanish down the street. The storm clouds were gathering again, their reflections rippling in the puddles like bruises in the earth. Inside, the air felt thick, as if the house itself sensed what was coming. Marcus walked slowly down to the basement carrying a lantern. The archway stood open, the chamber beyond still and cold. The shelves were empty now. Most of the documents had been moved or destroyed. Only the bare bones of the room remained. Brick, dust, silence. He set the lantern on the table and sat beside it, resting his hands on the wood. "They took what you left," he said quietly, not sure if he was speaking to Elijah or to himself. "But they can't take what it means." The flame flickered, throwing long shadows that danced across the walls. For a moment, he imagined movement in the corner. Just the shifting light, he told himself, but it felt alive. The old brass plaque on the wall gleamed faintly, its words catching the glow, "For those the world would not see." Marcus reached out and touched the metal. It was warm. That night, unable to sleep, he returned again to the cellar. The house groaned softly in the wind. The lantern's flame had burned out, but in its place a pale light filtered through the cracks of the archway, faint and silvery. Marcus stepped closer, heart pounding. The light seemed to come from nowhere, or from within the walls themselves. As he watched, it faded slowly, leaving only darkness. But he felt calm. The house was not angry. It was awake, and it was remembering. The following week brought a turning point. The digital archive that Carrie had compiled was released publicly by the university, accompanied by a press conference. The documents were authenticated, the handwriting verified. The city could no longer deny the history buried beneath its streets. For the first time, officials acknowledged the network of refuge houses and issued a statement of recognition. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was a beginning. Marcus attended the announcement quietly, standing in the back as reporters filled the room. When it ended, a journalist approached him, asking if he had any comment. He thought for a long moment before answering. "They tried to burn my house," he said. "They broke into a library to erase what they feared. But truth doesn't die in fire or silence. It just waits for someone to listen." Then he walked away, leaving the cameras behind. That night, he sat by the window once more, the rain tapping gently against the glass. The elm tree outside swayed in the wind, its branches heavy with water. Somewhere beneath the earth, his great-grandfather's work still endured. The bricks, the iron rods, the sealed air of that hidden room. Marcus smiled faintly, knowing that Elijah's legacy had not been erased but reborn. And as the thunder rolled far away, he whispered into the dark, "You can rest now. We remembered." The house creaked in answer, soft and content, as if exhaling after a century-long breath. Spring came slowly that year, as if even the weather hesitated to disturb the fragile balance that had settled after the storm of revelation. The snow melted in uneven patches, leaving streaks of dark soil that smelled of thaw and renewal. Marcus spent long mornings on the porch, watching the slow rebirth of the elm tree whose roots coiled deep into the ground beside the house. Its branches had survived fire and frost, and now small buds appeared, soft and green against the gray bark. The house behind him no longer felt like a relic or a burden. It breathed differently now, calmer, lighter, as though a century of held breath had finally been released. After the university's digital archive went public, the response spread far beyond the city. National newspapers picked up the story, turning it into a symbol of reconciliation and rediscovery. Messages poured in, some from historians, others from families who had lost track of their ancestry. A few came from strangers who simply wrote to say that the story had given them hope. Marcus read each one carefully, answering when he could. For the first time, the name Benton carried not just tragedy, but respect. The city council, perhaps out of guilt or necessity, announced the creation of a restoration committee for historical equity. It was the kind of bureaucratic title that masked emotion behind formality. But Marcus didn't care about the words. The intent mattered. Carrie was asked to serve as an advisor, and she accepted, insisting that the Benton House be included as a registered historical site. The process took months, meetings, inspections, signatures, but eventually a bronze plaque was placed by the front gate. Benton Refuge House, established 1899, rediscovered 2025. The dedication ceremony drew a small crowd. Marcus stood quietly among them, feeling Elijah's presence in the rhythm of the wind. He had spent the winter restoring the interior, not to erase the marks of time, but to honor them. The burned siding was left visible beneath a layer of clear resin, preserved like a scar that told its story. In the basement, the archway remained open, but Marcus installed a glass partition across it, sealing the hidden room not in secrecy, but in transparency. Visitors could see inside, the table, the shelves, the empty space that had once been filled with fear and courage. A soft light illuminated the brass plaque on the wall, the words now clean and legible, for those the world would not see. Every time Marcus passed it, he felt a quiet strength settle in his chest. The first group of visitors came in early summer, students from a local high school accompanied by their history teacher. Marcus led them through the house, explaining how his great-grandfather had built it, how the chamber had been found, how the truth had survived through silence. The students listened, wide-eyed, their sneakers squeaking softly on the wooden floors. When they reached the basement, Marcus paused. The air there still carried the same faint scent of earth and oil, but it was no longer oppressive. He told them that history wasn't something that lived only in books. It lived in walls, in the choices people made when no one was watching. A wall can hide or protect, he said. The difference is what we decide to do with what it holds. The teacher later told him that one of the students had written an essay titled "The House That Remembered." By autumn, Marcus had turned the house into a community space. With funds from the city and donations from private groups, he opened a small workshop on the ground floor, fulfilling his old dream of teaching young people carpentry. The benches were worn, the tools mismatched, but the room filled with laughter, sawdust, and the scent of cut wood. On the wall above the main table hung a framed photograph of Elijah Benton, the same portrait once hidden in the chamber, restored, its brass plate shining. Beneath it, Marcus had carved a line of his own. Truth is the work of our hands as much as of our hearts. Carrie visited often, helping with tours and documenting oral histories from descendants of those listed in the ledgers. Some came carrying stories passed down in fragments, songs, letters, faded photographs. They spoke of flight and loss, but also of kindness, of nameless helpers who opened doors in the night. As they shared their memories, Marcus recorded every word, building a new archive, one not of secrets, but of voices. Each story became a thread in a tapestry of remembrance that stretched beyond one family, one city, one century. Not everyone welcomed the change. There were protests from property owners whose ancestors' names appeared in the records as perpetrators of the raids. Letters arrived accusing Marcus of stirring division and rewriting history. He read them, sighed, and filed them away without reply. The truth was never comfortable, he thought. It was meant to unsettle before it healed. Over time, even the loudest voices quieted, drowned by the steady rhythm of life returning to the house. As the years turned, the Benton Refuge House became a living classroom. School children traced their fingers along the old wood, couples came to reflect in silence, and sometimes elders sat in the garden, whispering prayers of gratitude. On the anniversary of the exhibition, Marcus hosted a gathering each year, lighting candles in the basement and inviting visitors to leave notes on small pieces of paper. The notes were folded and placed into a wooden box, a new box crafted from the same oak that framed the original table. Inside were messages written in dozens of languages, all carrying. One evening, long after the last visitors had gone, Marcus sat alone by the open archway. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the city beyond the windows. The glass partition reflected the warm light of the candles, casting faint shadows that danced across the floor. He thought of Elijah again, of the night he must have sealed the wall, hands trembling, knowing he might not live to see morning. He imagined him hearing the voices of those he sheltered, the whispers of children, the hurried prayers. Marcus closed his eyes, letting that imagined sound wash over him, blending with the soft creak of the old beams above. He felt no fear anymore. The darkness that once seemed alive with threat now felt sacred, like a heartbeat pulsing beneath the floor. The house no longer held secrets. It held memory. When he opened his eyes again, he thought he saw movement beyond the glass, just the reflection of the candles perhaps, but in that shifting light, for the briefest instant, he imagined his ancestor standing there, his face calm, his hammer resting at his side. Marcus smiled, not startled but comforted. "It's finished," he whispered. "They know now." Outside, the night air was cool and still. He stepped into the yard where the elm tree stood in full bloom, its leaves rustling softly. From this vantage point, the city spread out before him, glittering with 1,000 lights. Somewhere among those streets lay the other sites, the other houses that had once formed the network Elijah helped build. Some had been demolished, others built over, but Marcus knew that beneath the asphalt and concrete, their foundations remained. He imagined future generations uncovering them one by one, tracing the same threads of history until the whole story stood complete. He walked back inside, locking the door behind him. On the wall, near the staircase, hung a framed newspaper clipping from the year before. "City honors families of the Forgotten Network." In the photograph, Marcus stood beside Carrie, surrounded by descendants of those whose lives had intersected through Elijah's work. The caption beneath read, "What was hidden has become a beacon." Each time he passed it, he felt the quiet pride of knowing that something broken had been mended, that silence had given way to voice. Later that night, he sat at his desk upstairs and began writing. He wasn't sure if it would be a book or simply a letter to the future, but the words flowed easily. He wrote about Elijah, about the room, about the day the wall gave way and the air of another century touched his skin. He wrote about fear, loss, resilience, and the strange, solemn beauty of unearthing a truth that refused to die. When he finished, he set down his pen and looked out the window. Dawn was breaking, a pale line of light stretching over the horizon. Downstairs, the house creaked softly, not in warning, but in greeting. He rose, walked through the quiet rooms, and paused by the basement door. The light of morning spilled down the steps, catching the glass partition and turning it gold. The brass plaque inside glowed faintly in the sunlight. Marcus felt a deep calm settle over him. The house that had once been a tomb had become a sanctuary. The voices it once held captive now spoke freely through the people who visited, the stories that spread, the lessons that would endure. He stepped outside into the yard as the first rays of sun touched the elm leaves, making them shimmer like green fire. A gentle wind moved through the branches, carrying with it a sound almost like a sigh, soft, content, eternal. Marcus closed his eyes and listened. The house, the land, the memories, they were all part of the same living breath now. And in that breath, the silence that had lasted for more than a century finally dissolved. From that morning onward, no one called it the haunted house on Fieldstone Hill. It was known simply as the Benton House of Light. And when visitors came, they would find Marcus working in his shop or walking through the garden, his hands always busy, his heart always open, ready to tell the story again. The story of a man who broke through a wall and found not ghosts but truth, and of a house that once whispered in sorrow but now sang in peace. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Hit subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. There are more unbelievable discoveries waiting in the next videos, each one more shocking than the last. Watch them now. Share this video with your friends